Ready? All right, good morning, everybody. Good mid-morning. It is my pleasure. My name is Anamaria Bukvic from Virginia Tech. It is my pleasure to introduce a session on decision-making on retreat. And our first speaker, Ayse Karanci from University of Florida, who will be talking about agent-based model to evaluate land occupation dynamics of coastal communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you don't mind, please, in the meantime, while she's setting up, put your phones in the airplane mode. They do interfere with microphones. And that's all.
Just over there, I can't see. Okay. So welcome everybody to this session. I'm excited to present in this conference because I usually just present in engineering conferences, and I really learned a lot, and I need to improve some of my thinking, I think. But today I will be presenting my dissertation research, which I did at North Carolina State University. Right now I'm in University of Florida. So as we all know, coasts are not only physical systems or human systems, but they are kind of in an interchanging area where we have all these different systems. So when I started my dissertation research, I thought, okay, we have to model all of them together because they are kind of in a fight in between which we want to find peace. And my objective was to develop a human-nature coupled coastal town model. Since I was in North Carolina, we generally have resort towns, so that is how I started. So I wanted as my objectives to have both social dynamics of coastal decision-making, to be able to represent the coastal landform change in my model, and since we have a lot of storms over there, I wanted to estimate how abrupt events change the system. And to do that, I developed the coastal management and occupation dynamics model. It's the agent-based model. It can simulate household occupancy decisions, simulate town management decisions. It utilizes geospatial and socioeconomic data. And one thing that I tried to do was to integrate risk perception of the households, so not all the decisions would be solely based on economic based decisions. So as I said, I use agent-based modeling in which agents interact with each other and their environment. So in a coast, households will interact with their neighbors, with their town manager, and also they will react to changes to their landforms. The model environment consists of a topographic layer which I divided into alongshore cells of 100 meters, which generally included like 5 houses alongshore. This allowed me to model the coast in a heterogeneous way because it changes. And in North Carolina, we have the dunes. We cannot build seawalls, so I was using dunes. Then we have the parcel layer in which we have our houses, as you can see. And then we move on to our agents. So there are 3 types of household agents in my model. The first one is the homeowner who needs to maintain their house, pays their taxes, and they make decisions about buying or not buying flood insurance. Then we have house sellers who are the people in the community or the people who own houses and rent them out, who decides to move out of the community and they are just searching for potential buyers, which brings me to my last agent, who are the home buyers who wants to buy property in the community. And then we have the manager agent, who is kind of a combination of both engineers, town managers, so they can adjust the taxes, they can do some coastal protection projects according to feasibility analysis that is being done in the model. So I'm not going to go into the whole rule system because it is a lot. But I want to talk about one of the things that I was using, which is relative community attractiveness. So I use this to decide each year how many people would want to move into the community. And it depends on 4 things. One of them is housing density. So in a resort town, if it is very crowded, people might not want to move in because then the beaches will be very crowded. People do want some peace. But also if it is very empty, then the tax base is low. And again, they might not want to, the community attractiveness would go down. Then there's affordability. If they need to do a lot of repairs, or if the houses are very expensive, again, the attractiveness would go down. The third one is expected flooding damage, and this depends on how many storms that they have experienced. And there's I put a time period. They kind of forget about storms after 5 years, which I took from some literature. Then they also look at if a storm happened, if there was damage. So they look at themselves and their neighbors, and if there was a storm and they observed no damage, they don't consider, they don't expect flooding damage. And the last one was beach width, because in North Carolina, in coastal communities, that is their, that is how they earn money. It is their attractiveness. They want their beach. And so using that every year, how many home buyers would come into the model would be decided. And then I told you there's interaction between the agents. So here I show an example of this. So a home buyer would decide to move in, would consider all the properties and try to move in to somewhere with ocean view, good beach width and flood zone, and it will kind of go into a bidding process with the home seller agent. So there is interaction between the agents. And then we have the town manager, and the town manager either does an emergency during replenishment project, which is kind of funded by FEMA. So the town doesn't pay much money for it. Then there is the nourishment, where they are putting sand on the beach. Here, I was using a locally funded project. So if they are doing a nourishment project, it means the household's taxes would go up. And there's, again, if they need to build up their dunes, they can do, again, a replenishment project. So in detail, I think I explained these, so I'm kind of, but so for nourishment manager agent looks to the town to locate the areas with like less beach width, and then does like a feasibility analysis looking at the households behind it. And the nourishment, during the feasibility analysis, the nourishment cost depends on the sand amount that they are using. And in the model, like I am not always using the same nourishment width or the same nourishment extent along shore. It all depends on the feasibility analysis that is being done in that time step. And the benefits are recreational value because the beach is wider, and the property prices increase because the beach is wider. And with the replenishment, well, if the dunes are bigger, it means that the houses behind it will be protected. So if a storm comes, this wouldn't happen. I am a civil engineer. This is exactly how the houses would break down during a storm. So I also mentioned the coastal landform change. So there's erosion due to sea level rise, and the long term, because of the small storms, the shore is going to go back. And then more importantly, we have the storm impact model. I'm not going to go into depth in this, but I was using a very good numerical model for this, and I validated it. It really calculates the erosion at the dune, the beach, the changes in the beach very well. And then I also get the inundation depth behind it. It varies, so if the household was closer to the dune, it will get a higher inundation depth, and then it would go down, and then I can calculate the damage to the household due to that. Skipping this. And then I use the study area of town of Nexet. Nexet is a very good town for North Carolina because they have a lot of data sources. We have had a good structure inventory in my university, which told me the elevation of all the households, the value of the houses. And they also had done a locally funded nourishment project, which was the first in North Carolina. So that was one of the reasons that I chose that place. So I combined the physical processes data, so erosion rates, storms, the topography of the region, and all the socioeconomic data to kind of create my model. And then I tried to see, okay, like what will be the results of different scenarios, and I created three different storm disturbance scenarios in which I used my model for 50 years, but then used a different scenario storm at the middle at 25 years. I used a 10-year storm, a 25-year storm, and a 50-year storm. And what I saw was, so if you look at the bottom graph, it is the households in the community. So for the first 25 years, since the conditions are same, the households numbers were the same. But once the 50-year storm hits, so it is the black line, black solid line, you can see the community does not recover because the attractiveness, the amount of money that they have to pay is very low. People had to move out. Their tax base is low, so they cannot repair, and they cannot do the coastal protection project. So it kind of created a tipping point, whereas at the top where there's a dashed line, it is just a 10-year storm and the community was able to recover. But this tipping point is pretty important for us because we would want to avoid that. And then coming to this conference, obviously we are going to talk about managed retreats, so I tried to think about a way to include that in. So I tried to think about, okay, how can I put that in? And we know right now, especially in North Carolina, communities do not want to retreat. We have a lot of news about it from all over US. So it is not a desirable thing. And that kind of made me think about new technologies because there's always resistance from beginning. So there is, this is the graph of technology adaptation, which a lot of people use. So we can see there's innovators and then people start to adopt it. So people will hopefully accept managed retreat, and then more and more people will go into it, and there will always be the skeptics at the end. So in my town concept, I tried to think about it like, okay, at the initial time, I would say still some people would, the innovators would be for it. And then people would start to adopt it. So I was still thinking about 50 years. But there are some skeptics who I thought, okay, they're never going to accept this. So I kind of put my time in between these to put that into my community attractiveness. But I also thought if there was a huge storm, well, I mean, the skeptics might go back into it. I don't want to say that we want that to happen, obviously. But yeah, so I kind of put a resistance to change as a new factor to think about managed retreat and put that into my model. So to be short, I know which areas are very vulnerable in this town, so I kind of decided on a managed retreat plan to determine, I know where the critical infrastructure is, so I kind of put an area as a, okay, this area is never going to be developed more. If the houses over there are damaged, they are not going to build up on that. And they are going to vegetate the area. So my storm, so when I was doing my storm modeling, it would mean it would actually get more protected. So this was the previous one. I'm going to kind of move quickly. So with the 10-year storm, here is the, so the dashed line is where I use the managed retreat. So it kind of, at the beginning, the community grows slowly because of that resistance, but at the end it reaches the same levels. With 25-year storm, you can see that after that scenario storm hits, because during the managed retreat we kind of removed some of the houses, the damage was low, the community was more prepared, so they kind of continued on growing. And with the 5th year, we can see that tipping point did not happen. So again, the houses had to move down, but community continued on growing. And so to my conclusions, I think we can, bottom-up household decisions are important, and we can use this model to evaluate different management strategies. And it has some limitations, but I think we will discuss at the end, and we will see there are actually future opportunities. Thank you for listening.
Unfortunately, we will not have time for any questions because this session has 6 speakers. So we'll first let all speakers talk, and then we'll see if there is time for questions. Our next presentation is on best practices that aren't enough, governance transformation in Louisiana by Justin Kozak from Center for Planning Excellence in Louisiana. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back up here for round 2 for anybody who joined us last hour. I'm actually giving this presentation on behalf of Camille Manning-Broom, President and CEO, and I just took this opportunity for a little visual discomfort for any design-oriented people to get some Comic Sans put in here. You're welcome. But I might rely on my notes a little bit more because this is another person's presentation, but because this is also the culmination of like kind of her life's work. And I think it has the potential to be the most impactful thing we do in Louisiana. So I first want to address the first part of that title. Best practices aren't enough, right? So this is a conceptual diagram of, there's some things missing on there, but that we've developed with some of our collaborators, James Butler from Australia, CSIRO, and Johan Vijay at University of Dundee. And really, to this point, we've only been addressing the real emergency. We have floods, we have famine, we have fires, and we're just looking at incorporating these best practices to deal with those specifically. This conference, what we're struggling with, and we need to have this conversation, is that conceptual emergency. Are we doing the right things? And then that will allow us to get to a point where we get to an existential emergency, like what is right? To use an example from the opening plenary, we had a buyout example, and we dealing with a real emergency. We're removing a vulnerable person from a risky place. The conceptual emergency, what is the right thing to do? Well, we have the moral imperative, or we're doing this for the greater good, moving people away. But then we got to an existential point in which we said, well, no, I want that to go to nature. If that's going to go to a rich person, I don't want to do it, right? Now, that is in some ways irrational, but it also makes a lot of sense. And so we have to think about that moving forward. Oh, they pop up. Here we go. Are we doing the right things? What are the right things? And then what is right? So talking about Louisiana here, this not quite scientific or not quite accurate, but beautiful map shows just how much water drains to Louisiana, 41% of the United States. Louisiana, much of it was built as a delta building process. So we're dealing with a lot of the after effects of that. We are sinking, we are eroding. But because of that, we also are the largest port in North America, combined truck flows, largest tonnage on domestic waterways. We also have a lot of oil and gas industry. It's the largest in crude oil production and second in natural gas production if you include offshore activities. Second largest fishery in North America, or second largest fishery in the United States. But like I said, we have a land loss problem. In 1960, this is what the coast looked like. As we move forward to 2017, we've lost about 2,000 square miles of coastal area. And we reached a tipping point, right? So we knew this land loss was going on, but we hadn't done a whole lot to address it. When Katrina and Rita happened, the devastation of Plaquemines Parish, the devastation of the city of New Orleans, the devastation of just a lot of these communities on the coast. And so the state created the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and they were given money, they were given authority over the coastal zone, and a directive over other state agencies in that zone. And so they've developed plans for restoring the coast, but there's some uncertainty there. And we look and, without action, we lose 4,000 square miles. Worst case scenario, with action, with $50 million, the top right picture there, we still lose 3,000 square miles in the next 50 years. So this is a big issue. Without the plan, again, zooming in on southeast Louisiana, but with the plan. That's what best case scenario looks like for us right now. So we need to adapt. And we have flood risk, and that flood risk is going to increase. So it's not just that we are in a risky place. It's not just that we're losing land. We're also dealing with a social component to this. The people who have the means to leave are making choices about where and how they want to live based on that flood risk, based on that land loss. This is adaptation, but it's means-based. The communities that are losing people in this image are becoming older and lower income, and those that remain in those communities comprise a disproportionately vulnerable population. And then those green circles, those communities, they're also not planning for this influx of people. So a lot of them aren't prepared. And so now they have student-teacher ratio problems or capacity issues, traffic. So these are the challenges we're facing. And, CPEC, Center for Planning Excellence, we've been dealing with this for over a decade. But now it's coming to a point where we can bring a lot of different efforts together to make change. So we're about a dozen people, landscape architects, scientists, planners, and we've done work at all scales on these challenges in the state. Back in 2007, we were part of Louisiana Speaks Regional Plan, which just looked at strategies for recovery and growth in Louisiana. 2013, there's an example of a community resilience plan. View from the coast, we went across the coast and talked to community leaders to ask for their local policy perspective on adaptation strategies for their community. And we presented this policy document to the CPRA. And then more recently, part of the National Disaster Resilience Competition, we were the lead authors on 6 adaptation plans at the parish level and a regional plan. So we've done adaptation planning at all scales. And we realize that this challenge is implementation and local context. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Transformational change is going to require transformative actions, but that's not easy, especially in the context of climate change. Because, and this is like our fundamental challenge. Society demands that institutional stability, but climate change demands that we have institutional change and flexibility. So merging those two is one of the challenges of our generation. And the stakes are high. Yes, the potential impacts are going to be enormous, but the slower manifestation of climate change makes it particularly difficult to alter deeply embedded values and norms and institutional practices. So a good governance approach in this era of climate change must be comprehensive in both structure and in its range of concern. Every public investment, whether it's coming from education, transportation, we have an example of health and human services here, labor, economic, or natural resources and environmental protection, it needs to be answering this climate change challenge. But in order to actually do that, we need all these people to work together, and they currently don't, across departments, jurisdictions, and scales. But to put that at a more human level, at the community level, the people that live there are dealing with the impacts of land loss and climate change, but they're also dealing with some combination of other stressors: mental illness, racism, poverty, disability, loss of job prospects, political and cultural strife. This is why those best practices, but in Louisiana's example, just a single agency tasked with dealing with protection and restoration is not enough. So to move the needle on that, to step forward in that, we began working on this approach in 2017 with the Rising Above Symposium. We deliberately engaged 3 communities that lie along that spectrum of risk. On that future 2067 map, this is a high-risk community that doesn't actually exist anymore on that map. This is a mid-range community where adaptation in place might be possible, and a coastal community that doesn't really have a storm surge risk now or 50 years in the future. That's kind of a receiving community. We brought all of them together and talked to them about what are their preferred adaptation options? What are the challenges they see themselves facing in that 50-year time frame? And so the purpose was to connect those coastal leaders with state agency decision makers and experts on land loss, climate change, community adaptation and planning, and engage them in a process of visioning and strategizing and probably more importantly prioritizing. How do we take steps to do this? It was kind of eye-opening to see what these various people thought of the future and to see them process the progression of the risks and hazards in their communities. And despite the differences in where they're all coming from and cultural differences in those communities, they put great importance on the need for improved coordination at the state level in ways that would inform their own local decision making and provide support for efforts they are undertaking at the local level. So with that, we stepped forward. And actually, in the center of this picture is Richie Blink, and he was a community organizer at the time. Now he's a parish councilman in Plaquemines Parish. And he said something that was it was great, and you can take it with you and use it as an example. He said, what we're dealing with now is like playing a game of Monopoly in reverse. He goes, we got to pick up the pieces, but we can either be really strategic about that, or we can just let it happen, he says. And I think we need to be really strategic about that so we can, reduce the amount of pain for as many people as possible. So with that in mind, we had a second event. This took place last October. We worked with the governor's office for this state agency resilience building workshop. We worked with the governor's office of coastal activities and his leadership team to gather the heads of every state agency in Louisiana and their number twos in a 2-day workshop. The governor, pictured there, he showed up for several hours. And the whole point of day one was to establish, the relevance of the coastal crisis to all of their missions. These agencies are working day to day. They are not thinking about land loss and how that's going to impact, their capital investments, how it's going to impact their services. We, established the need for all agencies to build capacity to integrate land loss and climate change into their existing planning processes. And we also, stressed the importance of institutionalizing this coordination across agencies and scales that facilitates the comprehensive approach that we're going to need to address climate change and land loss in Louisiana. So we took them through a drivers of change activity. We just said, thank you, what are the things that are impacting the state? What's bothering you? And so the top two out of there were political. They said there's politics getting in the way, governance challenges. That was seen as both like how the government is structured, but also like just basic run-of-the-mill everyday politics, partisanship. And then surprisingly, for a deep red state like Louisiana, this group picked climate change as their second one, or perhaps not surprisingly because of the awareness of their land loss. So we put those on two axes. We said, all right, we broke them up into groups and we give them all, A, B, C, or D. C is your worst case. It's bad climate, bad politics. D is, you got your politics right, but your climate's worse. A was your best case. You got them both right. B is in there. And we said, come up with scenarios for the future. And so they kind of drew things out. Here, a play on Louisiana's the boot, right? And so a play on words there. Louisiana has lost its soul. For some people, the worst result was LSU is not just losing to Alabama, they're losing to Vanderbilt. We came up with some morbid mottos down at the bottom. Louisiana, now you see us, now you don't. Or don't come to the coast, it'll come to you. So this was fun, but it allowed people to realize just how this might play out in the future. You see people leaving with a U-Haul and losing a tax base, and there were all sorts of different ways in which this manifested itself. So then on the next day, we went through, let's vision for the future. This is a 3 horizons framework. You step into the current situation. You say, what are all the challenges for you doing your job? And then you jump forward to the 3rd horizon, and you say, all right, what's your vision for the future? And then you focus on all those steps in between and say, okay, what is the first step or what is the next step to moving towards that 3rd horizon? And we came out with quite a few priority next steps. Vision setting and calls to action from the governor's office, supported by a strong communication strategy, conducting audits of agency programs and policies, missions, practices from which to develop recommendations for improving alignment, identifying catalytic projects that can be modified so to give examples very soon about what these projects might look like in the future, and other steps along those lines. So what were some of the lessons learned through moving through this? We saw that a lack of consensus and coordination between departments. They acknowledged it, they saw it, so what's the next step forward? Task force? They realized we very much are reactive, we're not proactive, and this is not just, part of Louisiana's way of operating. We hear it a lot at this conference. Hard versus soft infrastructure. Communities tend towards the hard infrastructure because it's something they can see, they can touch, they understand how it works. Soft infrastructure, land use regulations, those are a little different. You're also infringing on private property rights and those opinions. We're hooked on federal disaster relief. As a place that gets hit by a dozen hurricanes every generation, it's tough to think of a time in which you are actually blue sky day and all of your funding isn't coming from a disaster. It's also, take the Coastal Master Plan. I think it's got $16 to $20 billion of that 50 identified, and most of that's coming from the BP oil spill. So there's an irony for you. There's also that disconnect between funding needs and timing. People need help now, but that money doesn't come for years down the road. There's a strong need to coordinate funding across levels. There's examples of parishes trying to work together to address stormwater management issues that they share, but then when it came time to put an application in, the federal program said, well, only one of the parishes can get this money. And even though they've established that working relationship and a basic level of trust, they can't go back to their constituents and say, yeah, we got this money, but actually the other parish has it. So it fell apart. Experimentation. There has to be, a stomach for this, and so that's where that communication at the state level comes across. We can't not do things just because they might not work. Politicization of climate change. We need a bipartisan approach here. The Coastal Master Plan gets adopted unanimously. It's founded on all the best climate science. And so even though you would not get most of these state congressmen to admit on the record to climate change, they implicitly vote for it every time that they adopt this master plan. So we kind of use the master plan and the coastal land loss and that crisis as a proxy for climate change moving forward. We also need to engage the private sector. They're not doing this enough. They're kind of seen as hands-off. About an alternative future blue economy, renewable energy. And then we kind of need to take a step back. Live with water, not against it, right? I was talking with somebody yesterday about how homes are built these days. And, if we go back to when we didn't have levees and homes were elevated a couple of feet, you mitigate a lot of flooding issues and damage. So a return of three emergencies. Are we doing the right things? What are the right things? This is where we are here, so that one day we can finally ask that question, what is right? We can address all those other challenges. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce next speaker, Jory Hecht from University of Vermont, who will be talking about optimizing choices between local adaptation and permanent retreat under deep climate change uncertainty.
Thank you. Okay. Is it? I'm not sure it's open.
This isn't you, right?
No. Okay, there it is. I see it, yep.
Cool. And then we just go to...
Oh, yeah. All right. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. As I was introduced, I'm finishing up a postdoc at the University of Vermont. But however, the work I'm going to be presenting today actually is from my PhD at Tufts University, which from where I graduated 2 years ago. Really wanted to get back into this. Retreat was one of the key issues that I looked into during my dissertation work, and I thought it was really awesome that there was a whole entire conference devoted to retreat. So anyways, and then I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author, Paul Kirshen. He's currently a professor at the University of UMass Boston, and I did forget to represent him with the logo here. we also had a team. This research kind of spun off of an effort, of collaboration effort between the University of New Hampshire and the town of Exeter, New Hampshire, and their climate adaptation planning process. Let's get going. So many communities, municipalities in particular, are trying to figure out what to do about climate change and how they should adapt for it, given uncertain scenarios of climate change. So, if climate change isn't as severe as some might expect, as they anticipate, then they might overinvest in climate change. If it's more severe than they expect, they might underinvest in it and cause a lot of damage. So, one key question that many municipalities are facing is how should different types of investments be staged over the 21st century, considering different climate change scenarios. And more relevant for this particular conference is the question of when is permanent retreat preferable for different housing types. And as I mentioned a minute ago, this project is inspired by planning challenges in Exeter, New Hampshire. The case study that I'm inspired by is primarily a river flooding case study. However, many of the same floodplain planning principles and planning under uncertainty principles are also relevant and applicable to coastal communities. So Exeter might be best known for its boarding school, its prep, but it has a wide range of housing types, and I took inspiration from that. It has some very nice McMansions, and it has quite a few manufactured or homes, otherwise known as mobile homes. So one of the key things that I'm looking at in this research is what role does the diversity of housing types and their architecture play in the adaptation plan that a town creates? And while the model that I'm making can take into account trade-offs between different stakeholders, here what we're doing is we're looking at things from a municipal social planner perspective with some constraints that reflect the preferences and values of individual stakeholders, namely the residents of these three different types of homes. There's a two-story home with basements, there are two-story homes with basements, one-story homes with basements, and manufactured homes without basements, and there's 40 of each of these strewn across a completely flat floodplain on both sides of a river. And these, when embarking upon an adaptation planning process, and many of us have touched on this already in our presentations in this conference, there's a wide range of strategies that can be adopted. One of them is protective strategies. So here you see a picture of a small flood wall that's protecting a residential community, but oftentimes communities are faced between small flood walls with relatively weak foundations and much larger and taller flood walls with relatively stronger but more expensive foundations. So there's a significant capital investment that you incur once you get above about a 10-foot height that's required for a greater foundation. So that can definitely come into play. But in addition to community scale protection strategies, there's also many property scale ones, such as home elevation. Another one is accommodation. And here, instead of reducing exposure to flooding, we're focused on reducing vulnerability to flooding. And there's many different household strategies that can fall into the basket of wet floodproofing. And one we look at here is just a simple damage reduction factor that you get when you put in grates that allow water to move in and out of basements more easily, which reduces the likelihood of hydrostatic pressure differences causing structural damage in particular. And as Justin alluded to in his talk, you have U-Hauls, which symbolize permanent retreat. I bet we could come up with about 50 different ways to put this in picture form, but this is what I chose. And then one thing that I found that many optimization models don't consider in the engineering community is insurance, and that's one I definitely think is going to be really important in the future, and I've also put this in here. And finally, another strategy is just to tolerate some damages, especially from a municipal perspective. It might be, in government perspective, it might be cheaper just to tolerate some damages than to make everything completely flood-proof. And that's a big values issue, and in my model, the user has the ability to set what those damage tolerances are based on a range of social and economic factors and risk preferences. And I'll talk about that in a little bit later. But moving on, so in many presentations and many planning efforts, people are often considering specific adaptation scenarios. So what might we do? One strategy is large-scale protection. Another one would be multi-layer safety. Here we have a smaller flood barrier, and then we allow some flooding of basements, but we flood-proof the basements, and we avoid keeping valuable things in them, like water heaters, or just using them as finished rooms. And that type of multi-layered strategy is called a multi-layer safety strategy in some of the literature. Then another type of portfolio might just be telling everybody, encouraging everybody to move out with some generous buyouts or something else. So when we plan for adaptation, we can enumerate these scenarios, but there's all sorts of intricacies and combinations, and when we get to heterogeneous housing types, the number of scenarios from which to choose can become quite large, especially when we're looking at both community scale practices or measures such as flood walls, and how they in turn affect property scale ones such as wet flood proofing. So one thing, when we have so many of these combinations, and we might not necessarily know off easily which is the best, a decision support tool can come into play. So what I've done is I've created an optimization model that can help recommend decisions to consider for further evaluation. So briefly, the way that this works is that you have a chain of hydroclimatic models. You have global climate models that forecast different scenarios of climate change. Then we see what we examine the hydrologic and hydraulic impacts of those changes, with hydrology being the flow and hydraulic being the water levels. And then, so we do that outside of the optimization model, and that's an input into it. And then within the optimization model, which is GAMS, I'm not sure if have any of you used GAMS for any planning? One? Well, I could tell you more about it afterwards, but so anyways, you have floodwall decisions, and then those decisions modify the discharge depth relationship within the model. Then you can also look at what property owners can do, and then those decisions will modify the depth damage relationship within the model. And then the model will give you an Excel output for easy navigation, and it won't only give you what is the absolute best decision, but it will give you a wide range of different adaptation portfolios that are close to the best as well, and these we call near optimal solutions. And I think this is extremely important when using optimization for something as complex and uncertain and multidimensional as climate change planning, because it's really hard to know which scenario is going to materialize. It's hard to know if depth damage relationships are accurate. It's hard to know how well we're representing all these different types of solutions. So rather than just let the model decide for us, what we can do is generate a whole bunch of candidate solutions and then deliberate over them. And then this deliberation can also help us refine the modeling process further. And oops, I forgot to animate through this. And then we also have some adaptation financing mechanisms. We have between homeowners, municipality, and state. We have grants for floodwall financing and home buyouts. We have property scale adaptation initiatives. And we have property and betterment taxes going from homeowners to the municipality. We have insurance premiums that homeowners pay the state or federal government. And we have insurance incentives for adaptation and insurance claim payments going from the state, federal government to homeowners. So to quickly take you through my single scenario, the optimization model, before we talk about how to plan plan for multiple scenarios for which we don't know the probability, I'd just like to quickly run through the single scenario optimization model. The goal is to minimize the sum of flood control and damage costs over 3 planning stages for the 3 different types of property and during 3 floods of different severity, 10, 25, and 100-year floods. We have a mixed integer program with binary and continuous variables. We take a municipal social planner perspective. And as I said before, the model also generates near optimal solutions. And then finally, on the right, you see a graph showing the depth damage relationship for 3 different types of homes. As you can see, the manufactured home has no damage until about 2 feet or 0.62 meters, but then its curve rises steeply because they're just not very high. But then we have to face the challenge of planning for 2 divergent scenarios with unknown probabilities. So at Exeter, we ran climate change simulations, and in 2040 they didn't vary. We looked at the second highest and second lowest model. They didn't vary by very much, so we combined them into one scenario. But for 2070, they diverged substantially. So we want to find a plan that will enable us to avoid spending too much on climate change if it's not as severe as materialized, but also avoid spending too little on climate change if it is more severe than some might expect. So, I'm going to take you through some of the results. So first, we identified what the optimal solution would be for the low scenario. And you can see here that a multi-layer safety strategy was recommended, which involves allowing some flooding in the basements of the permanent homes, and in one case, one extreme event, in their primary living areas. You elevate the manufactured home up to its maximum elevation because it can only be raised so high due to structural limitations. So that's the optimum for the low scenario. So if we know that's what's going to happen, that's what we do. But if the high scenario materializes, we swamp the homes and their total losses. Opposite happens with the high scenario. What happens is you can see, I can't really use this that well. But anyways, you can see that you have a really high flood wall that's built, so there's only a little bit of flooding. And building the thicker flood wall is warranted here because of the severity of flooding. The only reason that retreat is not recommended is because property taxes are so high that the municipality doesn't want to encourage it. Then we have the min-max regret optima, which is sort of a compromise between the low and high scenario optimum. It's a solution that involves a larger flood wall, but not quite as high as a high scenario optimum. And it involves a little bit more flooding of the homes but you can see that it'll have different impacts for different homes depending on which scenario materializes. So under the low scenario, the manufactured home does quite well because it can be elevated above the 100-year flood, but under the high scenario, it doesn't make it up high enough. Then in addition, the near optimal solutions allows us to look at retreat options as well, or allows retreat options to emerge. So instead, these options might be a little bit more expensive, but they're not that much more expensive. And given all the issues that are not easily monetizable when it comes to permanent retreat, it puts this model in play and allows stakeholders to deliberate about retreat options. And if you just looked at the absolute best solution, you wouldn't be able to do that. And then I just quickly want to mention that this might seem like a very engineering-heavy model, but we have a lot of constraints that you can set for different types of flood damage tolerance. You can look at maximum in any individual event, maximum average, you can set maximum average damage threshold, or you can even look at more intricate economic analysis, such as you can use the willingness to pay for damage reduction studies or damage elimination and use that as a hassle cost. And then finally, I'd just like to mention that this model produces policy-relevant results. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to show them in much detail here, but property tax losses inhibit the municipal promotion of retreat. Another thing is that insurance incentives for adaptation encourage home elevation and wet flood proofing. However, in the case of home elevation, what happens is that, okay, I'm just gonna, can I just finish the slide? So basically we have, so what happens is that the incentives are great for people with permanent homes, but if flooding is severe, people in manufactured homes won't be able to benefit from them because they can only raise them so high, whereas if a flood wall were built, it would benefit all affected communities more. And then there's also some insights about wet flood proofing, the importance of taking into account housing stock heterogeneity, And this, just to remind you, this model can also examine public-private trade-offs. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank my collaborators, my funding sources. Only got into this a little bit, so if you want to find out more, please feel free to look at our journal publication or email me.
Our next presentation is Redlining, Blight, and Urban Renewal, a cautionary tale for managed retreat by Lynnette Widder from Columbia University.
Here you can put this one.
Well, no, but that's his presentation. I could give his presentation again, but I don't think it would be quite as, yeah, all right. Really?
Good.
All right,
Just press
perfect.
the little green.
I'll just do it down here.
Oh, yeah. Easy.
All right, well, it would be actually kind of entertaining if I tried to give an engineering modeling talk, because by training I'm an architect and architectural historian. So I somehow managed to end up in this session, but I'm not sure I'm going to be so helpful at giving you all ideas about how to make decisions about managed retreat. What I did want to talk about, though, was the precedent of redlining, where it came from. And what I'm hoping to do is to give a more differentiated historical account of what it was intended to do, how it came into effect. And the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, over the course of the past couple of days, we've had any number of cautionary tales. There's high awareness of who the potential losers are in a discussion of managed retreat. On the other hand, there's also quite a bit of discussion about incentivizing the private sector and leveraging the insurance industry, the real estate industry, and that is where I think this idea of looking at redlining again makes some sense. So I'm going to mostly read my talk because there's a lot of information to get through. I hope you'll excuse me for that. So I'll start by saying that in its most targeted usage, redlining has become shorthand for the practice by which home financing access and urban investment has systemically been limited based on the factor of race. This shorthand draws upon a formalized process begun in the aftermath of the Great Depression of deploying government agents to survey, analyze, and map the desirability of investment for specific neighborhoods in major U.S. cities, the creation of so-called red line maps, and the responses that the use of race, among other criteria, for judging investment quality triggered offers some valid lessons for the proposition of managed retreat, not only around social equity, but also around questions of proxy determination and information management. In this talk, I'll describe how redlining as a term has already entered the discourse of managed retreat in urban contexts, review the practices by which redlining has been said to derive, and propose some lessons to be learned from a more granular approach to understanding the roles played by data analytics, mapping, government action, and private sector agents. One of the best examples, and perhaps what might have or should have been a galvanizing moment nationwide for discussion of cities and climate change, was the impact of Hurricane Katrina on the lower Ninth Ward. Images such as this one embody the confluence of vulnerability, systemic racism, and the kind of debate about rebuilding or creating buffer zones that ultimately led to a conference such as the one we're attending. Indeed, this early hand-colored map from the 1930s confirms that this area of New Orleans, just to the right below Mississippi's Oxbow, had already been encoded as having the lowest rating for investment security. Early post-Katrina studies, such as this seminal report funded by the Russell Sage Foundation in 2006, provided evidentiary support for the long-term effects of this confluence of racial segregation, poor and underinvested urban infrastructure, environmental risk, and lack of individual access to the kind of financial instruments that over time might have changed the area's fortunes. The Russell Sage report uses the term redlining only a couple of times and in rather neutral references, but in other contexts, the questions about the viability of rebuilding led quickly to the use of redlining as an analogy for government-sanctioned city planning approaches that sought to limit, if not eradicate, the presence of communities in high vulnerability areas, And the controversy was especially great because, as Katrina had demonstrated, these areas were likely to be lower in property value and hence traditionally minority neighborhoods. The discourse of reparations, most famously evidenced in Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 article for The Atlantic, has foregrounded redlining and its culpability in the popular imagination. This, of course, was a recurrent theme in this week's news in recognition of the congressional hearings on reparations, as well as the Juneteenth observation. And indeed, as more recent examples of hurricanes in the U.S. has shown, both government policy and private sector financing regulated by that policy have produced extremely inequitable access to rebuilding infrastructure for communities of color and/or of lesser means. But rather than focus on this recognized correlation of vulnerability and government-reinforced inequality directly, I'd like instead to offer a historical description of how the process that led to redlining was intended to work, the standards by which maps were drawn, the way in which assessments intended for one purpose became the basis for others, the metrics considered, and the processes by which the implications of redlining were enacted. In response to the property value crisis precipitated by the Great Depression, the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, was founded in 1933. It was intended to act as a secondary guarantee on home mortgages to offset future market collapse, to establish industry standards, and to shore up markets by providing finance in exactly those areas that private lenders avoided. The HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, was established with the FHA to assess the factors that might impact the viability of any urban neighborhood. Those included building stock, income levels, terrain, occupants of inhabitants, and infrastructure. And these are two survey briefs from the Columbia area that I'm offering as an example. As has been well documented by the researcher Amy Hillier in her excellent work on the FHA, the maps created by the HOLC were actually rediscovered in the mid-1980s, largely thanks to research done by the historian Kenneth Jackson. The term redlining, however, to describe the practice of denying appropriate financing to minority neighborhoods dates to the 1960s. According to Hillier's research, the maps created by the HLLC were, however, not widely available even within government. They were expensive and complicated to reproduce, and they were actually never circulated among private lenders. Her statistical analysis of the likelihood that the FHA itself had denied lending based on its own maps proved that in most cases, the FHA made the majority of its loans in areas coded declining or hazardous, in other words, redlined, a finding that actually supports the contention that the FHA answered to its mandates for making up for the lack of private industry financing in these areas. So what happened? As Hillier also makes clear, private insurance companies, including Metropolitan Life, itself a developer of large middle and low income housing projects in, among other places, New York City, began the practice of color coding maps well before the HOLC maps were drawn. This map of Philadelphia, for example, was generated by an agent from Metropolitan Life. This revelation certainly implies that the kind of practices that by the 1960s could be called redlining had their origins in private industry. The role of government in counteracting or condoning these practices is another question. While the FHA maps were not widely available, Hillier's research confirms that the HOLC widely circulated its underwriting manual, and in many cases, in order to collect data for its maps, was reliant upon private industry adjusters for information, and in some cases, hired adjusters to complete its neighborhood evaluations. This fact argues again that there is a strongly interwoven culture of private and public actors. It's worth looking in greater detail at this manual to understand its possible contribution to redlining. These pages, for example, lay out a framework for evaluating the potential risk or value of a mortgage loan. although the more than 400-page-long manual is extremely specific about the criteria by which a property, location, borrower, etc. may be evaluated, it does not define the proxies by which each criteria should be measured. It does, however, operate on the basis of assumptions about a trend towards less concentrated housing stock, upward and social mobility, upward social and economic mobility that will allow, quote unquote, rising families to move to different kinds of neighborhoods, and the importance of investment in lines of transportation and communication to guide urban growth. These assumptions were certainly borne out by the trend towards suburbanization that characterized post-war United States. As shown in this illustrative sketch, established neighborhood values were used to estimate future values as increasing or decreasing of nearby areas in which development could still be possible. This is one of the few instances in which the manual hints at the salient relationship between data and prediction. What parameters and what proxies might be used to extrapolate future value? This point, parameters, proxies, and future predictions, brings the discussion back to the question of redlining's relevance for managed retreat. And on this slide, I replaced one of the reports I just showed earlier with one that includes the areas east of Morningside Park. And for those of you not familiar with that, that would be central Harlem. And again, you can see a real difference in the way the prediction for value increase or decrease is borne out. If we think for a moment about how circa 1935 the future prospects of an area might have been evaluated, then best practices might have looked at the nature of populations moving into and out of cities. Those moving in were often coming from situations under duress, immigrants from Europe, migrants from rural areas, and their capacity for upward mobility would have been judged relative to the society they were entering. Census information would have included these markers of national origin and race, just as it would have included statistical information on average earnings and predominant types of professions. This is no way meant to explain or excuse the use of these proxies, but for every reasoned argument to explain them, there are myriad other arguments that point to the ways in which the choice of proxies undermined the mandate that FHA was meant to reflect, rather than counterbalance the lack of access to capital because of private lenders' disinclination to invest in areas of high immigrant and minority populations. The FHA undertaking helped to systematize and reinforce those practices by codifying race and immigration from the private sector as effective proxies of future value. The legacy of redlining remains evident in the distribution of the kinds of soft and hard infrastructure that can influence neighborhood hazard exposure and resilience, ranging from urban resilience metrics such as paved areas, green spaces, and parks, or exposure to toxic waterways, and to more general measures of public health or economic stability. As scientists and researchers consider their roles in the debate over managed retreat, awareness of the long-term consequences of metrics chosen is vital. It is imperative to learn from the precedent of the FHA and its contribution, witting or unwitting, to the establishment of redlining and the slum clearance, or quote-unquote urban blight agendas that ultimately followed from it. So because yesterday was the NBA draft and we're in New York, I'm going to end with a basketball reference. For those of you who don't know, Jalen Rose's writing and talking about analytics, it's pretty great for anyone who's operating in big data. But my conclusions may be self-evident, but in many ways, I think what I'm trying to point out is particularly relevant in our data-driven cultural moment. First of all, that any proxy metrics derived from available data have to be chosen and considered with great care. One needs to be aware of unspoken agendas embedded in best practices to understand the political and social contexts in which recommendations and findings are going to be deployed, and to develop strategies for disseminating information that provide transparency across the spectrum of users and those to whom these metrics are being deployed. Most importantly, if the role of government is redress of injustice and the central goal is to rebalance what private investment will not cover because of long-term systemic inequitable practices, then we should not accept as normative the proxies that the private sector is using to justify its activity or lack thereof. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce Malgosia Madajewicz from Columbia University. Her presentation is titled To Adapt or Not to Adapt, Decision-Making by Residents of Urban Coastal Areas.
Thank you. Whoops. Hit the wrong button. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to, whoops. Oh, it looks okay up there. Okay. To present this work here. This is work that's, this is part of the research that I do with the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, which is a NOAA-funded RISA program that works with decision makers in urban centers in the northeastern U.S. to kind of develop science to support adaptation decisions. I want to recognize my co-authors on this and also gratefully acknowledge several NOAA grants that have funded this work and a grant from NASA. Okay, so the objective of this work is to develop information that can be useful to coastal residents for making adaptation decisions. Another perspective on it is it can help, it's information that can help think about, to the extent that residents make adaptation decisions based on a financial calculus, based on financial considerations, what incentives can we expect residents to have to undertake various actions, and what are the implications of that for what civic leaders, the public sector, community groups can do to incentivize action or help residents make adaptation decisions. Information that can be useful to residents, of course, includes current and future flood risk, but it also includes costs and benefits of adaptation actions, and the latter are currently much less available. The component of, and that's what this study is focusing on. We're just beginning this study. This is in early stages. I'm going to be talking about kind of the first thing that we're doing as part of this study. So the component of benefits of adaptation actions that we're focusing on at the moment are the avoided damages of future flooding. So if residents do not undertake any adaptation actions, they face certain expected damages. Those damages have costs. Not adapting is not a costless option, obviously. Understanding what those costs are can usefully inform adaptation actions. It is our understanding of what those costs are at the moment is limited by lack of good data on what flood damages, what costs of flood damages are. And so the data that we're using to estimate these damages is kind of one of the innovations of this work. That's what I'll be focusing on today. Another important component of the decision, of course, another benefit of adaptation is avoiding the loss of market value of your home. That's a big one that we've talked about quite a bit. We're not addressing this yet, but we're hoping to bring it into the this study in the next phase. So for this audience, I don't need to motivate why we are focusing on decisions being made by residents. Residents don't feature very prominently in planning and preparation for coastal flooding, but this conference has been discussing all of yesterday and today how important decisions that residents will have to make adaptation decisions. Their decisions are critical to adaptation. Another point that is very important is residents are the agents in the whole adaptation process who are at the moment the least informed about the risks that they're facing and the costs and benefits of adaptation action. So to the extent that information is helpful for making these decisions, and people make decisions in all kinds of ways, information is just one piece of it. To the extent that information is important, coastal residents are the ones who have the least of it. Residents can take a range of actions to adapt, starting from retrofits to homes, with elevating a home being the best known and the most expensive, but also including a range of other actions that are much less expensive but effective at avoiding damages, such as raising electric utilities, filling in basements, and a range of other things. Another action which is important is financial planning. So residents need to be financially prepared for the costs that they can expect as a result of future flooding. And of course, what this conference is all about, which is considering relocation. I want to acknowledge, we've been talking for the last day and a half about how complex the retreat, the relocation decision is. There are a lot of considerations that have to go into it. What I'm focusing, and I want to be explicit about the fact that what I'm focusing on here is one little piece that goes into it. It's an important piece. It's information about what's going to happen to you if you don't do anything. But it's just one piece that can inform a decision that has to take a lot of other considerations into account. And there is this work will be going into a bigger project that will be engaging with residents in a very flood-prone area of New York City around the whole decision of what adaptation actions residents can take. But I'm not going to be discussing that today. I'm just focusing on this piece of understanding what the costs of not taking adaptation are. So the data on which we base the cost of inaction come from a survey that I did in two areas of New York City that were particularly badly affected by Hurricane Sandy. It was a household survey done 2 to 3 years after the storm. The data that we're using here is from the Rockaways, the two areas, I don't know if I just said, the two areas where the Rockaways and southeastern Staten Island, we're using for now the data from the Rockaways. So the data document a range of outcomes after the storm. What I'm using here is data that documents recovery costs. So we have data on exactly what it is that the residents laid out, the money that they laid out to recover, some of which they got back from insurance or other financial assistance, and some of it they did not. It's those total recovery costs. So again, those are costs that residents can expect to incur if they haven't adapted, and as long as they don't take adaptation actions. They are relevant in our study area because after Hurricane Sandy, people, for the most part, rebuilt as they were before Sandy. So in the area that we're collecting data from, there was a huge amount of damage. Almost everyone, at minimum, had to replace their boilers and hot water heaters, and a lot of people had a lot more damage than that. But even focusing on the boilers and hot water heaters, it was around 5% of the residents raised their boilers and hot water heaters higher than they had been before Sandy. Everyone else replaced them right where they were before, so they're going to be facing the exact same costs in future floods. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you much about the data. I'll just say that the average recovery cost in this data set is $62,000. Oh, and what I should have said is that the residents did face a broad range of flood levels, right? So with these costs of recovery and these different flood levels across different properties, we can calculate a flood damage function, which is what we're using to estimate the costs of not adapting. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through the method super quickly. What we're doing here is estimating the expected annual damages using probabilities and flood levels associated with events with 10 different return periods that can occur in any one year, and using the flood damage function from the household survey data, putting those probabilities, flood levels, and damages for different flood levels together into an estimate of an expected annual damage over a multi-decade horizon. In these estimates, the water level for these different events is rising over time due to sea level rise. We're using median predictions for sea level rise, taking the numbers from the work that's been done for the New York City Panel on Climate Change, NPCC. My co-author, Philip Orton, is actually the author of that work. Focusing on low-rise structures, so structures that have fewer than 10 units. And estimating the present value of future damages for the next 30 years. So at the moment, we can do this for a number of different horizons. For the moment, we're focusing on what might be of interest to homeowners, kind of the typical mortgage, length of a mortgage, right? 30 years, applying a 3% discount rate, which we can talk about. So to summarize the results, the present value of damages over the next 30 years, the present value of mean expected annual damages is about $270,000 in this population. The average cost of elevating a home is $150,000. That cost can range a lot depending on your home. But what's perhaps more relevant to talk about is there's a broad distribution of present values of expected damages, as you would expect. And one of that present value is going to vary for a number of reasons, but one of the important reasons is the elevation of the home. So looking at the elevation of the lowest floor in the house, the lowest floor being the basement floor if the house has a basement, first floor if there's just a first floor. Houses up where the lowest first floor is up to 0.5 meter. The present value of now looking not at the average, but the median expected annual damage, which is lower than the mean, for the next 30 years is $730,000 about. So I didn't put here the cost of relocating, the cost of retreat, because those can vary so much. But I think from these numbers you get the idea. Households these households that live up to, that have lowest floors up to 0.5 meter, that's 30% of our sample. Clearly elevating a home or relocating from a financial perspective is a good idea for these households. The next kind of group within 0.25 meter of 1 meter elevation, another 32% of our sample, so now we're up to 60%. That present value drops down to $75,000, which you might think is, well, that's much lower. That's actually lower than the cost of elevating a home. But you need to look at these numbers as kind of the lower bound on the expected costs, because keep in mind that I'm not yet here accounting for the loss of market value to the home, which can be very substantial. And I'm looking at median sea level rise. So there can be much worse outcomes than this. So probably in this next group, both relocating and elevating a home are financially sensible actions. The rest, for the rest of the groups, the costs are lower. They definitely justify the costs of, say, elevating your electric utilities, which on average are about $15,000, but maybe not the larger actions. But as you can see here, there's a distribution of incentives to undertake kind of financial incentives to undertake individual action in this population. Different people, depending on their elevations and a number of other factors, will have different incentives to act individually. But we've heard a lot over the last day how individual action can have a cost, right? If people at these lower elevations who feel that they need to be moving start moving away, that has implications for those who remain. It has implications for the public services that are offered for those who remain. It has implications for the community. So this piece is kind of looking at the financial individual calculus, but people in their decisions need to be taking into account what others around them are likely to be doing when they're making their decisions. So just to conclude, decision makers that we're talking to are expressing a lot of interest in understanding these costs of what's going to happen to people if they don't adapt. We have some work to do to develop really good numbers around this, and one of the particular challenges is that we really need better data on costs of flood damages in different contexts. There are a number of other things that need to be done here. There's a lot of sensitivity analysis to see how these numbers differ for different time horizons, different sea level rise estimates, and so on. But at least an equally big challenge is putting these numbers in the context of an entire decision-making process, right? Where people are taking into consideration not just their own individual financial situations, but what others around them are likely to be doing and what that means for how they want to adapt. Thank you.